In the 19th century, as the United States grew and moved westward, the demand for lumber from timber also grew and moved westward along with it. In those early years, logging involved cutting an area until nothing was left and then moving on. The search for new stands of pine, primarily the prized white pine, brought loggers to the Minnesota Territory in the 1830s. Many of these loggers were from Maine and Michigan, also moving westward with the demand for timber. Rivers were the key to logging and transporting logs in those days. It was natural for loggers to move north following the major rivers, cutting trees along the tributaries of rivers such as the St. Croix and Mississippi. Because of different logging companies using the same waterways to transport their logs, a method was devised to mark identification of the logs for determining ownership when they reached the mills. This was through the use of stamp hammers, which were company brands pounded onto logs and ends of logs for identification. You see here stamp hammer marks of companies in the Big Fork Valley, including the Itasca Lumber Company with the letters ITA as their brand. Depleting white pine stands as they moved north, they began logging in Itasca County in the 1870s and 1880s, with land cruisers selecting the best stands along the Swan and Prairie Rivers and others that fed the Mississippi. Gradually, though, the easy pickings of pine by the convenient tributaries of the Mississippi River were disappearing. As the tree stands got further and further inland from the waterways, transportation of the cut timber was more difficult. Since logging was done almost exclusively in the winter, iced roads with inverted ice tracks were created using sprinkling water wagons to haul these large inland loads to the waterways for movement downriver and onto mills in Minneapolis and beyond. Horses could pull incredible loads on the glazed runways. Another reason for winter logging was to take advantage of the spring thaw and rains to create swollen rivers and streams to easily float logs downstream. However, to add more uncertainty for the lumberman, irregular and low water levels could create a financial crisis because of the difficulty in moving the logs in shallow water. As an example, in good years, it would take about 40 days to move logs from Grand Rapids to Minneapolis Mills, a distance of 320 river miles. But in a dry year, it could take 75 days, a much more costly trip. In looking for answers to these problems, railroads were developed further south with significant success. One prominent lumberman who pioneered with logging railroads in Wisconsin and Texas was William T. Joyce. H.C. Akeley and others acquired John S. Pillsbury's large timberland holdings in Itasca County in 1886 and formed the Itasca Lumber Company. In 1889, William Joyce's son, David Joyce, joined the company by buying out one of the owners. That same year, the three owners of the company decided to build a railroad into their Swan River holdings. But before they could start, they had to wait for the advancing Duluth and Winnipeg Railroad to reach Swan River, just to get the necessary equipment on site, as there were no roads to the area. Although their railroad logging spur did not get built at Swan River, by the end of 1890, the Duluth and Winnipeg Railroad did extend their trackage to Bass Brook by what is now Cohasset, Minnesota. The Itasca Lumber Company already was logging in the Bass Brook area, moving logs from Bass Lake through the brook to the Mississippi River for their mills in Minneapolis. This gave the owners of the Itasca Lumber Company their opportunity to finally build their sought-after railroad. They based the railroad at Bass Brook and named it the Itasca Railroad. Although it was organized separately from the Itasca Lumber Company, it operated under its wing. H.C. Akeley was its chief officer, but J.P. Sims was its local manager. They began laying rail in June of 1891 and created a shoreline spur along the Mississippi to deliver logs directly to the water. By August of that summer, their locomotive and Russell logging cars had arrived. They donned the engine number 1 and referred to it as the Itasca. By 1892, the Itasca Railroad had extended trackage 8 miles north into the woods to reach Deer Lake, and by fall another 5 were added. But in less than a year later, it all ended, with all the rail being removed. Factors for this were they had already taken most of the good timber from the area, Sumi Hills to the north created a construction challenge, and most of all, there was a lawsuit against the company for illegal easement at their southern terminus on the Mississippi. Also, for a number of reasons, Deer River looked as a much better place to expand. The Duluth and Winnipeg's tracks had reached there by 1893. There was better access to the Itasca Lumber Company's timber, and White Oak Lake, which quickly connected to the Mississippi, would be an ideal holding pond for their logs. Development on the new grade began immediately in 1893, and the old grade at Bass Brook would many years later become what is now County Road 62 at Cohasset. In February of that year, the Itasca Lumber Company leased its locomotive and 30 cars to the Northern Milk Company of Brainerd. In 1894, David Joyce died, leaving his business share to his son William. The Itasca Lumber Company then tentatively decided to name the new railroad venture the Minneapolis and Rainy River Railway, or M&R. With recent gold speculation at Rainy Lake, the newly chosen name was a dream of the owners of a railroad connecting Minneapolis to Rainy River. The railroad's name did not officially become the M&R until 1904, when it became a common carrier, and until then, the general public still referred to it as the Itasca Railroad. A headquarters camp was set up at the line's end by Little Bowstring Lake, which was 12 miles out from Deer River. By 1898, the company added 2 more locomotives, with 2 used at the hoist and the other hauling timber back to Deer River. It also had extended the rail another 12 miles to what is now North Star Lake. With the area lakes acting as holding ponds, the logs were so thick, if you were agile, you could walk across the lake from one end to the other without getting wet. These were the beginnings of peak years for the company. The Itasca Lumber Company built a combined office building and freight depot at the junction of its tracks with the Duluth and Winnipeg Railroad in Deer River. They also added a machine shop and section house. The section house was used for sleeping and eating quarters for the rail crews. Deer River boomed during this period. Rail yards were constructed to store the Russell cars. Also, as a cost-saving measure, the lumber company began a 5-year project to build a trestle across White Oak Lake in order to deliver their logs directly to the Mississippi River. By 1901, the spur from Bowstring Lake that had been developed to reach the plentiful timber at Lakes Grave and Potato, which is now called North Star Lake, and the Smith Lake chain, was decommissioned. These stands of pine were nearly depleted, and the lumber company began extending its main line northward to Turtle Lake. At the railroad's terminus at the south end of Turtle Lake, there were 2 steamboats, Cassie and the Jenny B, used for moving logs in the water and transporting travelers to the north end of the lake. Train passengers would depart from the train and then travel by boat across the lake, where they would reach Andrew Rapp's Landing and store. Then they would load their goods onto Nels Felsted's wagon or Welty's stage and be taken on the rugged tote road to Big Fork. A man by the name of John Lundeen had property on the south end of Turtle Lake. He saw the railroad creating potential for his land and developed the little town of Marcel with a lodge, saloon, and store, and also began selling lots. He named the town after Andy Marcel, who was a well-known and well-liked conductor for the M&R. In 1902, the railroad began hauling other companies' logs. These other companies were seeking out what was left after the pine was gone, and much of this was pulpwood and cedar, which was used for fence posts and telegraph poles. Also, to prevent accidents, a telephone line was added beside the M&R tracks. One of the early workers during this period was a young Thomas Arthur Brown, who went by his middle name Art. He is seen in this photo in Deer River to the right of Grand Rapids' Dr. Farrell in Farrell's sleigh with its team in 1906. He can also be seen here on the left running the flatbed hoist at the company's box mill. He was the company's master mechanic. When the Minneapolis and Rainy River finally closed, he would be the last employee of the company to be let go. Early on, the crews and others referred to the railroad as the Gut and Liver Line. Many legends have developed as to the origin of the name. Mary Dean Wolfe's written version here, which claimed it came from wildlife carcasses plastered across the front of the railway's engines, was a common one. And the story pictured here from the present Big Fork kiosk, which tells where a conductor was ordered to get back to Deer River quickly, only to arrive with 5 milk cows on its cowcatcher, may have been an added embellishment of Wolfe's version. However, others claimed it came from all the wild animal carcasses the railroad hauled to Deer River from the Big Fork Valley during hunting season. During the time they were hauling much of other companies' timber, incoming freight destined for logging camps and settlers moving in equaled outgoing timber products. A warehouse built across from the Deer River Depot to store these supplies, which included foodstuffs, much of which were liver and sausage, a principal food item destined for the logging camps. The widespread hauling of these staples is probably what led to the rail crew's nickname of the Gut and Liver route. Another name the crews gave the Minneapolis and Rainy River Railway was Misery and Rough Riding. However, it was the Gut and Liver moniker that stuck with the railroad. Art Brown's son, Marion, also worked for the M&R Railroad until it ceased operations in 1932. Marion is seated on the right with the rest of the day's crew. Nicknamed Brownie, he was a brakeman and worked with other long-time and well-known employees such as conductor Pat Daly, conductor Harvey Martindale, engineer Martin Carlson, and fireman Harlow Bonnewell. Marion, in later years, was interviewed by John Essie about his life when working on the railroad. In the interview, he talks about his take on the nickname given the M&R by the crews.
The lumberjacks used to say that the Itasca Lumber Company fed them so poor that the meat was like guts and liver. So that's where it got its name. It had various names. Another one was Misery and Rough Riding, as the initials indicated.
The logging cars of the day, Russell cars, of which the M&R started with 30, were not designed for safety. They were designed for convenience in hauling logs and were notoriously unsafe, especially when loaded to the max like this. They were used for hauling logs from the cut sites and holding lakes to the Mississippi for flotation to the Minneapolis mills. Again, Marion Brown explains the design and use of these cars.
They used a Russell car. The Russell car was a very unique type of car. It never was condoned by the Interstate Commerce Commission, who governed public transportation. By being it was their private railroad, of course they had no jurisdiction over it. And this Russell car is a car with a set of what we call trucks or wheels on each end, but only long enough for one tier of logs. And the cars, while in later years, cars that hauled timber all had stakes. These cars didn't have stakes. The logs were bound to the car by chains. But the one reason for that was because so much of the timber was so large that it didn't take many logs to make a carload. I can personally remember some cars that 5 logs constituted a carload. There'd be 3 bunk logs, 2 middle logs, and a top log. And I don't know definitely, but I don't think that in those days they cut timber less than a 10-inch top. So there was a lot of big timber. But in later years, when the M&R became a common carrier and they came under the jurisdiction of the Interstate Commerce Commission, these cars were outlawed.
Marion continues with logging cars being used as passenger cars.
Some of the settlers that went into that area, especially those that went as far as Dora Lake, the railroad company permitted these early settlers to put their supplies that they were taking with them up to the area on these Russell cars. Mm-hmm. They put what little lumber they had across. There were only 2 bunks on these cars. There was no bottom, just the 2 bunks. Mm-hmm. And they there was some lumber on that, and then pile whatever their stove or whatever they might have with them on that on these boards. And when they got to the end of the railroad, which was right there by Bowstring Creek, mm-hmm. they would unload these things and put them in a boat and use boats to get to their destination up in the Dora Lake country.
Marion Brown would eventually become the Standard Oil bulk agent in Grand Rapids. In 1903, H.C. Akeley retired and William Joyce became much more involved in the company's operations. Jesse Junction was built with a spur heading to Jesse Lake. At this junction, a company section house was built for the rail crews. The name was later changed to Alder. Alder would eventually be abandoned and disappear from existence. That same year, they continued to push the spur northward and westward, 13 miles to the town of Wirt, where the spur ended in about 1904 or 5. It also developed spurs along the way to the nearby lakes. Wirt, at this time, was a lawless frontier town also known by the name Rattlesnake. The town was minimal, as most wilderness towns were, consisting of a post office, saloon, and hotel. It also had a restaurant managed by Rattlesnake Annie McAllister. On July 20th, 1904, the railroad finally became incorporated and officially became the Minneapolis and Rainy River Railway Company. It also became a common carrier, therefore regulated by the Minnesota Warehouse and Railroad Commission, and subject to control of its rates. However, this gave the railroad the right of eminent domain, solving a lot of its easement issues. For the year's time, between the summer of 04 and 05, its rates were 3 cents per mile and had sold 7,175 tickets. It also employed 54 workers who shared 54 injuries during that same time. Total freight, which was mostly timber and its products, was 147,703 tons. In 1905, the railroad was up to 7 locomotives. It also had 1 passenger car, 2 boxcars, 93 log cars, 20 gravel cars, and 2 cabooses. It also had a roundhouse for maintenance of its growing fleet of locomotives. William Joyce had purchased the huge Akeley lumber mill in Minneapolis, and it became part of the Itasca Lumber Company. But Joyce also saw the advantage of a mill on the site of their logging operations in Deer River. He joined forces with the Pillsbury Watkins Company to harvest the remaining non-pine timber, the hardwood and cedar, of the Big Fork Valley area. Along with this plan would be the development of a mill in Deer River. Since this type of timber did not float well, it would be best to process it on the spot and then sell the resulting wood products. Prior to building the mill, the Itasca Lumber Company began logging the hardwoods near Turtle Lake in late 03 into 05 to stockpile timber in preparation for the impending mill. The new mill would be the Joyce Pillsbury Company, but before long Joyce bought out Pillsbury. The company began building houses at the White Oak site where the mill would be constructed. This was the beginning of the town of Zempel. The company's roundhouse was also located in Zempel, and behind the roundhouse one would find the locomotive water tank and machine shop. Although pine logs were still transported to the Minneapolis mill by water, in 1905 the new mill was up and running and producing 120,000 board feet of lumber every 24 hours. The population of Deer River almost doubled, going from 400 to 700. When Joyce took over the company from Pillsbury in 06, he renamed it the Deer River Lumber Company and then added a planer to the mill. His Itasca Lumber Company was in boom times now, with 31 lumber camps averaging 125 lumberjacks per camp and 100 railroad men. The lumber company decided to continue northward with the rail and abandon their original plans to cross Turtle Lake. In 1906, they began grading their rail line to the east of the lake, which earmarked the demise of Old Marcel, which was later rebuilt further east by Rainier Lake in 1910, also close to the new line. By August of that same year, they extended the Gut and Liver by 11 miles, reaching Big Fork. They also added 3 more engines, bringing their total to 10. Before the railway came in, logs from this area were moved down the Big Fork River north to the Canadian border. Now, with the M&R in town, the Itasca Lumber Company could benefit by moving logs south to its mills. Big Fork was a popular destination. Because of the confluence of the Rice and Big Fork rivers, early settlers could get there by boat. Now, with the railroad came increasing supplies and access to this wilderness area with more businesses and a population that continued to rise. Early on, the area had its own school for settlers' children, run by Forrest Cochran. It also boasted its own sawmill and hotel, and like most small communities on the edge of the wilderness, had some of the ubiquitous watering holes. However, they had their share of problems and heartache. Just before the official Big Fork opening, a major derailment caused much damage, taking 2 days for clearing and rail repair. Another disaster by Jesse Lake in March of '07 was more serious, resulting in the death of young engineer John McVeigh and conductor John McNaughton. McVeigh, in control of engine number 5, was heading south with a full load of logs. Northbound was engine number 8, and they collided. McVeigh was only 21 years old. The blame was placed on Marcel's namesake, Andy Marcel, who, against orders and better judgment, felt he could reach the siding before number 5 reached him. Although a popular man in the area, he abruptly moved to Michigan. Accidents were not uncommon, as you see here engine number 8 losing its load of logs en route to Deer River. The Great Northern Line, coming from Grand Rapids and through Cohasset, crossed the Minneapolis and Rainy River tracks at Deer River as the M&R tracks approached White Oak Lake near the Great Northern Depot. At this crossing, a Great Northern train, after taking up water, backed up to collide with the Gut and Liver's engine number 5. A Great Northern crane had to be brought in from Superior, Wisconsin to reposition engine number 5 back on the tracks. With rail service, Big Fork could more easily get freight, supplies, and essentials into town and would begin to see its first tourists and curiosity seekers. Its depot had a similar design to M&R's office headquarters and depot in Deer River. This progression of the railroad opened up easier access for settlement of the Big Fork Valley, and the M&R expanded its passenger service. With Deer River as the hub, the destination on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays was Wirt, and Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays was the Big Fork Effie area. A trip from Deer River to Big Fork cost the passenger $1.22. Sportsmen and hunters also used the train's services, and the railroad obliged the hunters in transporting their deer back to Deer River, where they were loaded into Great Northern boxcars for their final destination. The Great Northern Railroad, much earlier, had taken over the Duluth and Winnipeg tracks. The Gut and Liver's freight and passenger success during this period can be seen in the change in ridership and freight tonnage from the '05-06 season to the '08-09 season. Freight going from 188,127 tons to 346,343 tons, and passengers from 10,176 to 22,304. Reaching for more timberlands, in 1908, a trestle bridge made of timber was built across the Big Fork River, and the road pressed on another 8 miles to Effie. The trestle also proved to be a good place for the locomotives to take on water from the convenient source of the river. Like many of these stops, there would be a small station located at Effie. In March of 1909, William Joyce died at the early age of 49. He left his estate and business interests to his 2 sons, David Gage Joyce and Stanley Joyce. At this time, the rolling stock of the railroad was 4 passenger cars, 8 box cars, 95 flat cars, and 293 logging cars, along with 11 locomotives. The railway consisted of 64 miles of mainline track and 44 miles of spurs and side tracks. Although business was booming, bad signs were on the horizon. Timber, the company's mainstay, was becoming more scarce. Adjustments were made to add spurs to both Dora Lake and Pomeroy off the Wirt line. These were built primarily to haul other companies' cuttings, and since the timber was poor with much swampland, the spurs were abandoned by 1915. Continuing northward in 1910, the line reached an Itasca Lumber Company logging camp run by foreman John Craig. Craig died that same year of brain cancer, and the campsite became known as Craig. Unlike the man who was its namesake, Craig had a well-deserved reputation as a rowdy, lawless place with drinking, brothels, and reportedly even murders. It was probably considered the end of the line in more ways than one, but it was truly the end of the gut and liver's tracks. The M&R would never go farther. David and Stanley Joyce expanded their Deer River Lumber Company mill in 1910 and closed their Minneapolis plant in 1911. They now changed their company name from the Deer River Lumber Company to the Itasca Lumber Company, and besides the routine hard and softwoods, began sawing and planing white pine at the Deer River Mill. From then on, all logs would be processed at the Deer River Mill. With timber disappearing and fewer log trains heading south, now through open spaces that were once forests, the M&R relied more and more on settlers and their freight to prop up the business. It was a transition to a new era. In Burgett Anderson's book, The Last Frontier, pioneer A.I. Nelson wrote a poem that Anderson felt depicted this new era. In solemn splendor, giant pine trees grew along the Big Fork River's winding shore. No human sound their ancient stillness knew, save stealthy dip of passing Indian's oar. The turning of the century's busy year beheld the loggers and the cruisers tread. Then changed the stillness, came the pioneer, and with his hewing, sawing, silence fled. It was the majestic white pine that brought in the logger, and the logger that brought in trains to take more, and the trains that brought in the homesteaders that transformed the Big Fork Valley from wilderness to civilization on the edge of it. The scarring from clear-cut logging would heal over time, but never return to the majesty it once held before the arrival of entrepreneurs searching for that wooden gold. This was a transition time for the gut and liver also. What once was primarily logging trains gave way to passenger and freight trains, usually carrying a mixture of materials and people, such as lumberjacks, timber cruisers, settlers, school teachers, businessmen, and missionaries. Once pristine coaches now were shop-worn with signs saying, "No spitting on the floor," with an exclamation mark. Pat Daly, an M&R conductor, during boarding would separate the boisterous and intoxicated lumberjacks from other travelers and place the jacks in the smoker car and the more refined into the coach. Usually a flat car and a box car too would also be in tow with supplies for logging camps, country stores, and settlers. There were not many new acquisitions during the next decade. One exception was the speeder car, which the employees called the Black Maria. Not only used for moving crews and inspections, it was occasionally used for medical emergencies of rural settlers. For the decade following 1910, the M&R was the main method of travel in the area. Besides the main depots in Deer River and Big Fork, the railroad had tiny depots at the County Road, Sumi, Alder, Marcel, Pines, Janes, Collins, Effie, Craig, Mac, Jesse Lake, Spring Lake, Bass Lake, and Wirt. Other sites shown were side tracks and spurs to logging sites. Settlers continued to expand into the territory, build schools, and establish businesses. Bringing livestock and more modern conveniences, the area became less of a frontier. However, it was not an easy life. The people of the area were still dependent on the land for much of their subsistence, whether it be gardening, hunting, or fishing. Automobiles were introduced to the area after 1910, but at first their use was minimal. This was primarily because of the lack of roads, and what roads they did have were horrible for driving. The automobile expanded in use, but with the roads so poor, the gut and liver remained the dominant force for travel. These awful roads often required chains on tires and could drive a man to drinking. A typical day in the area would be a scene like this at Spring Lake, which was on the line heading to Wirt. People would be waiting for the train to arrive, either to travel or send something off. Sometimes they would be waiting for some expected delivery of an item or supplies. There would be excitement or a buzz in the air as the train pulled into the town. The stop would be short, with a quick loading and unloading of supplies, including the much anticipated mail. Mail delivered to these community outposts was by the M&R. Once there, it would be handed off to the local postman for dispersal within the town. Before long, the train would be pulling out on its way to the next stop, Bass Lake. Waving as they pulled out would be two of the crew, which included Marion Brownie Brown. Although financial times were worsening, David Gage Joyce, a wealthy man and very familiar with the area, began the process in 1918 of developing a retreat estate on the shores of Trout Lake in much the style of the popular eastern Adirondack camps of the day. It was located near the terminus of the family's original Itasca Railroad north of Bass Brook. This property today is managed as a semi-primitive, non-motorized area by the U.S. Forest Service. Eventually, however, in Itasca County, roads began to improve, lessening the need for train travel. The improved roads also allowed the use of trucks to move timber and established a viable option for loggers and others to compete with the railroad. World War I was another factor in the financial distress of the M&R. Depleted timber, decreased demand, and low prices caused the closing of the Itasca Lumber Company's mill in Deer River in 1921. 5 years later, vandals would set fire to the old mill. Bus service also began in 1921 between Deer River and Big Fork, further cutting into the railroad's profits. All of this created a tsunami of losses for the M&R, and the Great Depression was the final nail in the coffin for the railroad. Although residents fought abandonment, the Interstate Commerce Commission allowed it, and the Gut and Liver had its final trip on August 27, 1932. Crews used the last locomotive of the railroad, engine number 12, to assist in the removal of all rail, and by December of 1932 had taken up 7,000 tons of track. Art Brown's lifetime career with the Gut and Liver would come to an end, and he would be the last man out the door. Topographical hints of the Gut and Liver still exist today. If one were to superimpose the route of the railroad, shown here in dark blue, over a geological or road map, you would realize in a number of areas you would be driving over or adjacent to the roadbed of the old line. The green line, here heading north out of Deer River, is the route of the Minneapolis and Rainy River Railroad tracks. If you were to head north on the Alder Road, which is County Road 253, where it meets with County Road 48, you would be riding directly over the route of the M&R. Where 253 meets with County Road 262 and Forest Road 2151 is where Jesse Junction, or Alder, was located by the railroad. If you were to go left or northwest at this intersection, you would be following the spur that eventually goes to Wirt. Continuing on at the intersection with Highway 6, you would be at Mack, the first small depot on this line. Remnants of the line follow the eastern shore of Jesse Lake and Little Spring Lake and the western shore of Spring Lake. The route then swooped around Four Towns Lake, swinging west and traveling up the eastern shore of Bass Lake into Wirt. As far as the main line to Big Fork, at Marcel, just to the west of Rainier Lake, you would be traveling on it for the most part by staying on Highway 38 north to Big Fork, Effie, and Craig. In fact, if you look closely when driving Highway 38 a little south of Big Fork, looking to the east, you will notice its bed directly parallel to you, now being used as a snowmobile trail. Both to the north and south of Big Fork, you'll get glimpses of the old line running beside you. On the north end of Big Fork's main avenue, just before you cross the Big Fork River on Highway 38 at the kiosk site, you will find a short trail which will take you to the Minneapolis and Rainy River Railway's trestle, which crossed the Big Fork River, and you can even walk across it on a new walking path, which is also used as a snowmobile trail in the winter. Not a log trestle as the very first, but an upgraded one prior to the railroad's demise, made of concrete, wood, and steel. It still stands as a monument of a time long ago when logging reigned and homesteaders challenged themselves to a new environment and where the gut and liver was essential to both. Wooden remnants of a time long ago also amazingly remain standing in water after 100 years as a testament to the fortitude and ingenuity of the hard-working men of that era. Portions of the trestle at the railroad spur into North Star Lake are still evident today. If you were to drive to the public access of White Oak Lake at Zempel, almost a southern appendage to Deer River, you would be driving over the old rail bed with an approaching view of the great M&R trestle across White Oak Lake. If you asked locals in Itasca County today if they knew of the Minneapolis and Rainy River Railway, most would probably say they never heard of it. But ask if they ever heard of the Gut and Liver line, you'd most likely get the opposite response. After all, the namesake of the railroad was such a misnomer, as it never came close to Minneapolis or Rainy River, and so the name just didn't fit. But talk about a railroad blazing into the wilderness called the Gut and Liver, now that's a name that fit, and people could get their head around.